Hello and welcome to new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. So, I'm Dinakar Peri, your host for today. There are several takeaways for the short but intense 5 day conflict between India and Pakistan under Operation Sindoor in May this year. One of them is India's air defense system or multi-layered air defense network that came under a lot of stress but stood out and won a lot of praise. So, to discuss that, this episode will focus on breaking down what air defenses mean and so on. For that, we have with us a very erudite expert, Air Marshal Diptendu Choudhury. He needs no introduction to anyone following the aerospace domain in India. He's an avid writer and expert. He has accomplished fighter pilot with over 5,000 sorties on various type of aircraft, right from the MiG-21s to the latest Su-30s. And he retired as the commandant of the National Defense College in New Delhi. Welcome, sir. Welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you, Dinakar. It's absolutely a pleasure to be sharing the same screen with you.
So, our pleasure. Sir, to begin with and to put the subject in context, I would ask you to kind of give an overview of what air defense systems mean, how do they function. I mean, there's a lot of misnomer. People imagine say something like a Star Wars or missiles firing or lasers shooting. It's not that simplistic. There's much more to it. Can you put that in context for us?
Okay, before I begin with air defense, I just want to bring out one fact because people tend to misunderstand this. Air defense is a very important part of India's air power, that is the Indian Air Force, and it is a major aspect because air power comprises of two essential elements. One is offensive air power, and other is air defense. And I just want to put the record straight that while it was our air defense which defended and saved us from the adversary and adversarial air threats, it is actually the offensive air power which prevailed upon the adversary with his sheer capability to push him towards the ceasefire table. So it was the offensive air power which brought him to the ceasefire, and it was air defense which kept us safe. So, if you realize that both of them had a very synergistical role in the larger national defense architecture. Okay, now we take on air defense. Right from the beginning, I want to, I think all of us must be aware of this, that the responsibility of the nation's air defense, of sovereign airspaces, and the defense of India from that perspective, air defense is a critical aspect and is a prime responsibility of the Indian Air Force. So this is something which is, earlier in the earlier wars. That means when I look back and think about from the 60s, 62, the first serious war which we got into. And in those days, air defense was a weak aspect in our national security. And in fact, we didn't have enough radars. We didn't have enough aircraft in those days capable of interceptions. And if you remember, it was after the 62 war that we reached out to some of the other countries and to seek help. And that's the time we started looking at air defense seriously. And we picked up, radars and better interceptors for day and for night operations. So by the time we reached 1971, we had reached a level where we had a fairly robust air defense system. And over the years, this air defense system has gotten expanded. And if you look back, it's very difficult. Air defense per se comprises of two aspects. One is the surveillance aspect. We have an enormous landmass, and you will appreciate that all the airspace above our landmass is sovereign airspace. So anywhere you have Indian territory, whether it's the mainland or in the islands, the sovereign airspace above it, which goes up to almost 60,000 feet, and that is a normal conventional height or altitude which most nations look at as their sovereign airspace. And so the air defense extends all the way till that. So it's an enormous volume of airspace which we have a responsibility of. And to compound that, we have threats across our borders, which are directly co-joined with our borders in the north and in the west, that is China and Pakistan respectively. And both have very strong air forces over the years. So air defense becomes a huge critical factor in India's defense. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, the sovereign airspace part is has to be covered from a surveillance point of view. That means you need radars, enough radars scattered all across the borders and as well as the mainland, where the coverages of these radar contribute to a holistic volume of airspace. That means we would like to keep track of every square inch of this entire airspace, but that's not easy. So just Air Force radars are not enough. If you remember long back in the late, I think 80s, when we had this Purulia arms drop case, and that's when we realized that while our borders are taken care of, but inside the country, our airspace coverage is not so good because we tend to obviously focus when it comes to air defense on the borders, especially. So that is when a decision was taken that no, we need a coverage of the entire airspace holistically, and that's when there was a famous group, Mirani Committee, which was formed and which looked at this, and it gave some recommendations to government. And over a period of a couple of decades after that, Air Force has been inducting radars and systems accordingly, so that we can get a eye out and our sensors out in the entire volume of airspace. Should be able to see the entire airspace. But just seeing is not enough. So the entire seeing has to be integrated. And in this case, very interestingly, it is the Air Force radars and the civil radars which were integrated into one holistic volume to give a holistic air picture of the entire subcontinent. And of course, this was during the peacetime role. Now, how do we network it? Sensors typically also need shooters or interceptors or the kinetic element of air defense, which complements the surveillance. So, which are fancily nowadays called sensors and shooters. So, the shooters comprise of two elements. One is the aerial element, which is the air defense interceptor, which are usually typically high-tech modern aircraft, like in our case, the Sukhoi, which essentially performs the air defense role. It is armed with a wide array of missiles, long-range missiles, beyond visual range missiles to close combat missiles. And they form the dynamic element of this kinetic weapon system. That means the fighter can get airborne from anywhere and intercept any platform or adversary anywhere. So they are dynamic, they are not fixed. So this is the aerial element. And along with the aerial element comes the static element. Not static, I stand corrected on that because nowadays they're all mobile as well. The surface element, which is the surface to air guided weapon systems, which comprises of an array of surface to air missiles of different caliber, different capabilities and ranges. So these two form the two kinetic elements. Now, how do you link these two, the sensor and the shooter? How do you control them? So they ride on what is called the IACCS in our Air Force. It was, I think it's about almost a couple of decades old. It's called the Integrated Air Command and Control System. What is it essentially? It is essentially a system, an architecture, which rides on the Air Force net for net centricity and connectivity. So basically, it's a communication and data connection which connects the sensors, the shooters, and the command and control system. So that the person who is looking at monitoring the air defense scenario has an entire picture of exactly where is the threat, what is the threat, its height, speed, direction, and all that, and which are the shooters available. So this whole thing gets integrated in what we call today a integrated air defense system, IADS.
It's essentially the backbone for the whole.
Absolutely. Earlier, if you remember, the weapon capabilities, system capabilities were limited. Radars at smaller ranges, the SAM missiles at smaller ranges, and we couldn't possibly cover the entire airspace. So we used to cover critical places. That means, in our nation, we have something called one is the military targets as well, which we have to defend. But more importantly, we defend what are called strategic targets, and critical target systems of the nation, which could be from industries, power plants, refineries, railway stations, critical infrastructure, command and control nodes, all kinds of stuff. So this whole thing, to bring it under a common envelope, is where what the air defense's entire goal is today. Now we have come a long way from the past, where the weapon systems and the radar's capability has enabled the entire integration.
On
So
that
this
note,
is what it is today.
just more anecdotally, on the AD part of it, where the fighters come in, you have this called ORPs.
Yes.
For viewers, ORP is an operational readiness platform. It means fighter jet which is on the tarmac, ready to take off. There is a threat. They're literally waiting. So can you just any anecdote, something to make the viewers give out
Oh,
of
yes, most certainly. Because I've been an air defense pilot all my life, and then I've been AD commander of two commands. So I think I've been half of my blood is an air defense color, I think. But on the lighter vein, a lot of my younger years were spent on what you mentioned, the ORP. So what is an ORP? It's a small tarmac which is usually at the end of the runway, where you take off from. So we have, what we call blast pens. So they are concrete reinforced semi-underground sort of
shelters?
shelters, aircraft shelters, where two armed aircraft with missiles and the works, they're air defense aircraft, they're parked on readiness. And very close to it, right next to it, is what we call the ORR, the restroom,
Yes.
where the pilots are there. Now you're on 24-hour watch, though you're replaced in shifts of 8 hours. Uh, so since you're on 24 hours, you need a restroom where the pilots are. So these rooms are semi-underground to an underground room, which are connected the shortest way to those blast pens. And in this room, you have an entire set of communication systems, which are connected to the air defense node, from where all your communications come through, and all your alarm bells and readiness bells, alarm lights, everything is there. So typically, what happens is whenever there's an aerial threat. So now, when we are in this ORP, inside the ORR, that is the restroom, we are on what we call a standby 5. That means from inside the restroom, you're supposed to scramble and get airborne in less than 5 minutes. But typically, what happens when you have an advance warning, and air defense, they track threats from a long time. So, moment they pick up a threat, which they feel that this is a probability of this being declared hostile, first thing is they upgrade the readiness state, in which alarm bell rings, and there's a loudspeaker inside which tells us, mission number so and so, you are on standby 2. Repeat, standby 2. Which means now we run from there, get into the aircraft, strap up, get ready to get airborne. But we are not yet airborne. We are only strapped up and ready. So what are you doing? Cutting down the reaction time. Now when they declare the threat hostile, they give a call, what they call the scramble. So there's a very, loud call which screams in the speaker, and because it's a blast pen, it echoes a lot.
Yeah.
It says scramble, 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 mission so and so, and then they give you your initial vector, which is the direction and the height to climb out to, and thereafter basically you're airborne for an aerial interception. So this is how the whole system works.
Scramble is what is typically shown in the movies.
Yes, it's very
Pilots
fancy.
racing with their helmets and
Yeah.
go to the aircraft.
So that is how it is. But I mean, we've done some. So from aircraft to aircraft, the scramble time varies. I remember the MiG-21, we could get airborne within less than 2 minutes. And in fact, anecdotally, I remember we were doing this air defense in the southwestern sector in the Kutch area, and that time there was this interception. I mean, one intruder which was picked up. Intruder means it was an unidentified aircraft, and from standby 5, we straight away got a scramble. And but we were so tuned and trained, we got airborne from inside the ORR in 2 minutes. I mean, it was, you just sprint, dive in, but that was the simplicity of the MiG-21 platform.
Yes.
But more contemporary platforms like the MiG-29, the Sukhoi, they take a little longer, another minute or so. They are, I think, on standby 3. That's
Just
the
again
only.
a bit of context here. The MiG-29s, probably the oldest fighters in the inventory, and they are a star. I mean, they have done 62 years of service. They're going to be phased out next week in Chandigarh, the last of the last two squadrons. So that's end of an era, just for context sake.
No, absolutely right. In fact, a lot of our old timers and a lot of our younger flyers also, they've all gone through the MiG-21.
Okay.
So they,
Yes.
I think that aircraft owns a piece of all of our
Yes.
hearts.
But it was the trainer also for a long time before the AGTs came in, the advanced jet trainers came
Absolutely,
in.
absolutely,
It was
absolutely,
the
absolutely.
last stage of training. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
sir, on that note, just from what
yeah.
you said, taking it one step further. So Op Sindoor, the whole system stood up. So can you just put up what stood out, what actually fell in place?
Okay,
From
so
my days.
yeah, sorry. Okay, so if we just spoke about how the whole architecture is integrated. Now, to give a little more detail before I take on to Sindoor. Now, what happens is we have radars which look earlier air defense conceptually was defensive in nature. What I mean is in the sense that you only in the earlier days you intercepted an aircraft after he entered your airspace.
Yeah.
How far our weapons could fire,
Yeah.
things like that. It made a difference.
Yes.
But in the recent years, and this is something I've been writing about for quite some time, is with the acquisition of the S-400, we have now capabilities. And in fact, most of our missile systems, S-400 is the longest hitting missile. That means it's got the longest kill range, which goes up to close to 400 kilometers almost. And next layer is the next layer of medium range SAMs, which are in the region of about 120 to 100 odd kilometers. Then comes the intermediate range SAMs, which are about 40 odd kilometers. Uh, and then comes in the closer systems are what we call the close-in weapon systems, which are there to defend the target as a point terminal defense. So they are close-in weapon systems or CIWS, which typically comprise of guns with a high rate of fire and uh, short-range quick reaction missiles.
Man pads.
Could be manpads, could be on a
Yeah.
stand, but they are quick reaction missiles. They're not very big. They're typically short ranges in the range of less than 10 kilometers, 5 to 8 kilometers or so. So if you see, not only are the radars looking deep inside enemy airspace, so the we have radars, high power radars, which look deep inside at high altitude. Then you need low level radars, which look at the lower level altitudes because one radar cannot cover the entire airspace. And then we have airborne platforms like the AWACS and the AWC aircraft, which are essentially airborne radars, which because of the altitude and the coverage, they give a dynamic coverage of the airspace. So they supplement this entire thing to give a holistic three-dimensional uh, air situation picture.
But ground
Today,
radars are limited by the curvature of the Earth. So the
absolutely,
AVACs. So the
absolutely,
AVACs.
absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, our ISCC system today is so well networked that today you can be sitting actually in Trivandrum and see the air picture of Srinagar, of the Northeast, anywhere you want. So that is the way the whole thing is integrated, digitized, networked beautifully and put up. So this is the sensor element which I mentioned earlier, and then we bring in you merge this with the surface-to-air guided missile, which I mentioned from the S-400 to close-in weapon systems. So what is it now? Now you have a air defense volume or a coverage which actually spills over into the enemy airspace, well inside.
Hmm.
That means effectively I can shoot down the enemy in his own airspace.
Yeah.
So
Because
that's
to
why I
begin with,
say, yeah, air
to begin
defense
with,
is no longer defensive.
yeah. No, to begin with, you actually track up aircraft taking off from the runway itself.
Absolutely. And if you so desire, and depending
Yeah.
on the situation, in
Shoot
peacetime,
him
you
down.
just track him. In operations like we did in Sindoor, you shoot him down.
Yeah. Exactly.
So this capability is enormous because what it happens is it denies the enemy his own airspace for his own aircraft to fly safely. So this is what our integrated air defense, which like to call extended integrated air defense system, EIADS. Now I wrote about this about 3 4 years back, and I think uh, fortuitously it's all coming together and being proven correct. Anyway, it's not just me, but point is all APA thinkers possibly think the same way. It's just that I articulated the word when I talk about it. But the larger point I'm trying to make is that air defense is no longer defensive.
Defense.
It's about dominating adversarial airspaces today. So this is what happened. Okay, so now let's look at Sindhu. What happened? We will not go into the details of how it all started. Those are all known. It was a reaction to a terrorist attack. And it was, I think, Balakot, we had set the precedence. Interestingly, in Balakot also, most people don't realize the target was Jabba Top.
Yep.
And we actually penetrated the adversary's air defense in peacetime, which they don't like to talk about. And we carried out the attack. But that was one target. But it set a precedence and it gave us an opportunity to expand air power's role in the lower end of the conflict. That means in the gray zone, the officially war has not been declared. So it's a peacetime zone, peacetime condition. So it enables the use of kinetic air power offensively in peacetime. So when when the national leadership took a decision to hit back after Pahalgam, look at the scale and mass we did it. Okay, so we did hit 9 targets across the entire spread. We penetrated the air defense and we hit this. Penetrated the air defense means our entire, we didn't cross over without crossing over, standoff capability, but our ability was able to penetrate their air defense and hit the target system so that, before they could figure out and react and defend themselves. So air defense played offensive AD here played a role. If under the cover of offensive AD, we fired these weapons standoff from our side of the, well inside our territory. Typically, after we hit terror targets, intention was very clear at that point in time that it's a political signaling, a message that terror will not be accepted. And we made a distinction. We hit terror targets, we didn't hit military targets. So essentially, we made a distinction between the terror element and the state. But the state responded in a manner which now it was clear that it is no longer, the whole issue became clear that it is now, we are free to take it from there, that it is now state-sponsored terror. And now we can as well as hit the military target systems. Why? Because in response to our first attack, they responded and hit our airfields. Hitting an airfield in peacetime tantamounts to an act of war. I think the Indian political leadership showed enormous maturity, where we didn't escalate it into a war, but we said no, but we will give a riposte. We will give a suitable reply, a kinetic reply hard enough for them to understand. And that is why we carried out subsequent attacks. Now, in these attacks, the enormous role played by offensive air defense cannot be ignored. Why could we carry out these attacks with impunity? It is because our offensive air defense, which looks deep into their territory, prevented the enemy air of coming and interfering with our operations. It denied them the use of their airspace. So that is how we were able to carry out these attacks effectively. But along with targeting our airfields, they also hit us with a large amount of drones and missiles. Now the missiles and drones were taken out by the larger ones with the part of the air defense system. But this is another part which is interesting, and because army typically, historically, their role of air defense was limited to wars, where main role of the army air defense was at that point in time to defend army assets during operations and supplement the IAF's defense of VAs and VPs, that is vital areas and vital points of the strategic targets. So earlier days, they had L-70 guns to defend these bases. Yeah. But about a decade plus earlier, the army started getting missile systems, and these guns had become pretty much redundant simply because their ranges were not adequate. Threats were not coming across to those ranges. But this operation, and this is what a spin-off from what we have seen in the Russia-Ukraine war. Drones, missiles have become the reality today. And so these weapons sort of became worth their weight in gold when the drones started coming into the close ranges, at very close ranges. So by then, actually, the Indian military and the aviation industry had also wizened up to looking at what's happening in the world, and started making these anti-drone systems, counter UAS systems. That means counter unmanned aerial systems. You know, so they are against, because you must understand drones are small. They are actually, drones can be from a massive size of an aircraft, huge aircraft, to a tiny handheld mini mini and micro drone. So only a certain radar cross-section signature, that means larger drones are visible and picked up on radar. Smaller drones need different kind of radars and surveillance systems. So this lower end of the system, of the air defense system, that means up to, let's say, almost 10 odd kilometers, you have the larger air defense structure, which comprises essentially of Air Force SAMs, interceptors and radars, and supplemented in war by Army's missiles and Army's guns. So this Army part of the integration is what was riding on their system, which is equivalent, similar to the ISACS, called the Akash. Now, Army had been working on this for a long time, and this time they were successfully able to integrate their counter UAS systems, their LLAD guns, that is the L-70 guns, and the Zoo guns, with their sensors, and plug into the larger air defense architecture of the which the Air Force has. So this time around, we first time probably in operations, actually the Army and the Air Force integrated their air defense elements towards the defense of the nation. So that is how it played out in Sindoor.
In fact, the lessons of Ukraine, all these guns were actually upgraded, new sights, new ammunition, which actually proved, in a cost-benefit analysis, to take down drones, because you can't shoot down a small drone with a costly, expensive missile. It doesn't work.
Absolutely.
The economies don't work. You can do
Yep.
it once, but not every time. The numbers.
You make a very interesting point. Some of the drones and missiles attacks which have been carried out by the Russians against the missiles, against the Ukrainians, go into billions of dollars.
Yeah.
One strike I was reading, which occurred in the early part of this year, was close to the cost of the missiles and drones put together came to close to 4.6 billion. I forget the exact number. Dollars.
Yeah.
And what did they take out? Few buildings, few weapons, few structures, few weapon systems. So targeting is a very important aspect, but the dynamics of that war is entirely different. So we can't really look at that.
That exactly happened 2 days back. I mean, last week, what we saw, Russian drones coming into over Europe, Poland, and etc. They
Absolutely
scrambled F-35s and Eurofighters firing expensive, air-to-air missiles. For what? They were, a few thousand worth drones.
true. So you bring out a very interesting aspect. I'll just cover one bit when you brought in the cost effectiveness. People tend to draw wrong lessons from wars. Because the context of each war is different.
Yeah, exactly.
So the point which I want to bring out here is two things: is that drones and missiles have expanded the scope of employment of the air.
Yeah.
So aerial warfare, earlier it was typically looked at from man fighters and man bombers, but now it's opened up to include missiles and drones. Okay, now they are cheaper options. So what happened was, the Ukrainian Air Force was very small, and the Russian Air Force, there are a lot of structural issues. They are not geared doctrinally and structurally to carry out depth strikes using air power. They've never done that. So despite having fantastic platforms, they have not done that. So when they did the first initial attack, Rostomol Airport and those initial strikes, they did not kill the Ukrainian air defense with what we call as SEAD and DEAD missions, suppression of any air defense or destruction of enemy air defense. Now that is typically an approach which we, the West, most of the air forces in the world employ. That means you take out critical radars and critical SAM systems so that your air force has freedom to operate in enemy airspace. Russians didn't do that, and that hurt them very badly. So now Russian have a very potent air defense system. Ukraine has a very small air force which rapidly went out of business. So Ukraine had no means of going inside Russia and striking them except using drones. Okay. On the counter side, now Ukraine didn't have an air defense or an air force to defend itself from the air. So it had to fall back to its air defense system, the surface to air guided missiles, all of which comes under the Ukrainian Air Force. So they survived because the Russians didn't kill them. So then they took NATO help to move them dynamically all over in a manner where now Russian Air Force aircraft couldn't enter the airspace because these systems were alive and kicking. So the Russians had to use standoff targeting. So the point I'm trying to make is that Ukraine fell back to a system of what was called as air denial, which a lot of people are talking about, and some have even suggested that we should adopt air denial. I want to make one very strong and clear point here. Air denial is a strategy of a country which does not have an air force or a very weak air force. It's a defensive strategy. It cannot save you. It can thwart some of the attacks, but a determined adversary will get you at some point. So you can't win a war by only defending our airspace. So that is why I want to put this aside, that air defense is something which we should deal with in a very careful manner when we make these assumptions that India should get into air denial. This aside, let us look at a quick, before I just end here, quick look at the cost ratios. You brought it out. The Iron Dome of Israel, which is the innermost layer of the defense system. A missile costs, any idea?
Few millions.
Absolutely. And it's almost, I think, $50,000 or thereabouts each missile, $50 or $80,000, I forget. Whereas the adversary is using World War II vintage missiles, modified, which cost only $5,000. Look at the cost benefit.
So the other
Challenges.
point we actually miss is production rates. These are
Absolutely.
sophisticated ones. You can't produce them. The what you fire over a night takes several weeks to produce.
Absolutely.
It's not months.
Is what the modern technology industry, defense industry, call it the scalability.
Yeah.
You don't have the production scale, and in war, if it prolongs, you need a production system running side by side.
Fall back to, yes.
Fall back to and running 24/7, to keep filling it. So while you can produce arms and shells and smaller weapons easily, but you can't manufacture missiles in such a rate overnight. So there is a challenge. And one aspect I want to bring it here, and I'll kill this point here itself. Iron Dome worked for Israel because it's a tiny country. So it could actually cover the entire Israel through a 3-tiered system, which covers the entire volume. Look at the size of our country. How much ever, if we spend our entire defense budget only on air defense, even then we will not be able to cover our entire airspace.
So I'm glad you said it. It's actually something we miss. The nuance we miss that.
Absolutely. When people talk about,
Iron Dome for India,
yeah, so why can't we get this? No. Yeah. So you have to look at it contextually, that our biggest challenge in the scale. So what is it? We always defend the important parts which needs. So that is something which is revised constantly. What we call the VA, vital areas and vital points, which needs air defense to come under the air defense umbrella. Those are reviewed periodically. And with modern day today's state of affairs from what we were in probably 60s, we have so many more industries, power plants, energy sectors, data centers, control nodes, communication centers, ships. I beg your pardon, ports, railways, yards, airfields, airports, aside from military targets. To cover each of them
because
is a
economy
challenge.
is more important. If your economic nodes are hit, everything falls apart.
So our system will be a blend of what should I say, a larger holistic surveillance, most certainly, and the kinetic elements spread out in a manner to cover the critical aspects.
So on that, in fact, you kind of give you the trigger for the next question what I was about to ask. So, okay, we have proven now, stood the test for all the probably the several decades, years of efforts actually fructified here. We proven in action. But now the adversary knows what you have. I mean, they have got a conflicts also reveal what you have. This actually reveals. So you normally you fly with the radar closed. You don't open your radar because it will give away your signatures, etc., etc. This is actually such a moment. Now the adversary knows it, and we can be sure it will be passed on to the other adversary as well. The bigger threat for us. So how do you now go about it? How do you maintain the edge? How do you prepare for a and especially so because now the threat of a two-front conflict is metamorphosing in a different way. I mean, this actually Operation also proved that there was real-time assistance, as several of our military officials were on record saying, there was live assistance being provided by China to Pakistan. So in this thing, how do you go forward? How do you keep this edge now? You built it. The challenge is not to maintain it.
So this is a typical nightmare of all military people, and so we work in a very different manner. See, unlike the other services, for Indian Air Force, air defense is a 24 into 7 into 365 business. Other people come into other services come into operations only when there is a threat of conflict or some operational threat where they are put on alert. Whereas Indian Air Force air defense is churning throughout, and in the sense that and the readiness states keeps getting kicked up depending on the situation. I mean, you could have any geopolitical situation or something happening on the borders. Like there was a time when if there's an assassination of or it happened in the past when a leadership in Pakistan died, we went on alert. Anytime, so anything like this happens. This is when in the past, if there's a slightest threat across, instability across, first thing what you do is there's a possibility of them using the military. First thing you do is up the air defense. Republic Day, Independence Day, 10 other, I mean, there are so many issues where the air defense gets upgraded, wherein more radars are brought in, there are only a certain amount of radars and fighters kept on ORP. You can't keep the whole ARP on Air Force on readiness. And they are done in rotation so that they don't wear out the system. So it is done in a very well planned manner. But moment it comes to operations, all your radars are deployed. And like you said, all your radars come on. So moment a radar comes on, you're emitting signatures and which the adversary picks up. So there are ways and means to manage that. That is what we have a very strong electronic warfare element to this, which manages our entire signature management. How do we do it? And there are alternative frequencies and things like that. Anyway, we don't need to go into the details, but rest assured that there are separate elements for peacetime and separate aspects for wartime. But in a wartime, when you opened up, there is a threat. And we have seen how rapidly threats are analyzed and counters brought in.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that in the drone war in Ukraine itself. Initially, the drones played havoc. Then we reached a stage they were shooting down on an average now, I think about 10,000. Rusi report stated, Rusi of UK, the think tank, they brought out a report which stated that hit about 10,000 drones a month. So point I'm trying to make is any weapon system, any signature, everything will find a counter moment your hand is given out. And you said very rightly that these are criticalities. That is why you will find that beyond a point, though there are a lot of people who are very keen to know more, the Air Force doesn't let out some information. Though we'll find a lot of veterans who speak a lot volubly about a lot of things. But there is a need to be careful in it, because today with OSINT or open source intelligence, you can put 2 and 2 together. So this is something you have to be very careful of. But what you brought in was a very important aspect, is the help from our adversary, the second adversary. Now, China and Pakistan have been operating hand in glove for ages. They are strategic partners. There are iron brothers, as they declare. But what is more interesting is when it comes to the air power aspect, that these two air forces, the PAF of Pakistan and the PLA Air Force of China, have been exercising together for over a decade in something what is called as exercise Shaheen. So they have gone through about 10 exercise Shaheens in the last decade or so. The last one was held in 2023, where they have been increasingly participating with each other's assets, aircraft, radars,
Mhm.
airborne radars, weapons systems together. They've been training together. And it's a win-win for both. Pakistani Air Force, which has its own aircraft manufacturing company at Kamra, called PAC Kamra, Pakistan Aircraft Corporation Kamra, they are supported by the Chinese actively. So the JF-17, they make the airframe, whereas the engine and the other avionics and all that comes from China. So it's a joint production.
Mm.
Apart from that, so it means that Pakistani Air Force benefits from Chinese platforms, technology, weapons, weapon systems, space imagery, hell of a lot. I mean, all kinds of advanced cutting edge technology which it can glean from China, which China is happy to provide them. How does China benefit? China has never fought a war since Korea, 1950s. It has not seen conflict. It has got modern platforms, but it has not had international exposure to fight in the way where Indian Air Force is trained all over the world. So it benefits from Pakistani Air Force, which has international exposure, which has fought uh, against India extensively, and it benefits from learning Indian tactics, which the Pakistani Air Force monitor carefully, and now the Chinese Air Force have access to it. And the last point in that, now this brings in a dangerous cooperation, apart from the all the technical weapons systems and aircraft and other technological assistance. We now have a situation because there are common platforms. You can have both the air forces flying against us, and you will never know it because at long distance standoff ranges, you will not know whether it is a Pakistani platform or a Chinese platform.
True.
There lies a danger that tomorrow, while geopolitically it's not easy to happen, but Pakistani Air Force has a history of flying for other air forces. It has done with a lot of Middle Eastern air forces.
Yes.
It has fought against Israel. It has fought against Soviets uh, in Afghanistan. So it has a fair history. So this becomes a challenge. So the point which you brought out, this collusivity, which we used to say earlier, collusivity, to my mind, it is active cooperation now. It's no longer collusivity. This is something which we have to be very wary of. Because air power was the only asymmetric advantage which we had against China in Tibet.
Yes.
In Galwan and in Doklam, the Chinese were still worried because the way Indian Air Force spun up so quickly. Because the PLAF was not as active in Tibet. They have altitude limitations. They can't fly with full weapon loads at those high altitude bases. We know that. They can't deploy on those bases because of the extreme temperatures. They are seasonal. So they come on seasonal deployments. So the PLAF, the Chinese Air Force, has very little offensive capability, which it supplements with the rocket force. Because it doesn't have offensive air power capability in adequate capacity and capability in Tibet, it supplements it with the rocket force as an offensive capability. Because most of it is Air Force's offensive capability, which is being developed very rapidly, is focused on Taiwan and South China Sea. So this is a challenge. So the Indian defense ecosystem, which I think they did some fantastic job, it has to scale up, put its research and development into high gear, and build up these systems which we are riding on into make them more robust, redundant, and futuristic. For example, my view today is that the ISCCS system, it is due for an upgrade. It's been upgraded along the way, but it needs to be upgraded to include the space element, space surveillance from it. Satellite inputs and all have to be merged actively. So the IACCS, which was integrated air command and control system needs to become an integrated aerospace command and control system. So that is the first off. Second aspect which we need to build up is what I was talking about, situational awareness, the three-dimensional awareness of the entire airspace. Now, earlier we were happy with this volume of airspace of 40,000 feet, 60,000 feet coverage with more and more powerful radars. But the near space, which is below the Kármán line typically is supposed to be the artificial divider uh, of the space and Earth's atmosphere. So that Kármán line, and it extends at about 100 kilometers altitude, is where roughly the Kármán line is. That is a norm. That is a norm taken. Above that is considered space. Below that is considered near space. That means just below the Kármán line to about 60, 80 or 1,000 feet. Now, we need visibility of this volume as well. Why? Because space-based launch weapons, missiles, ballistic missiles, surface launch weapons, air launch weapons will transit through these airspaces. So you need surveillance coverage. So air defense coverage, or what was earlier air domain awareness, which was restricted to the airspace, now needs to open up into aerospace domain awareness. So you have to integrate space elements into your surveillance system. And then comes the third layer. What is the most criticality? So you have IACCS, Aerospace Control and Command System, futuristic, network, data-centric, cyber-protected, a lot of redundancies, which will then we look at aerospace domain awareness, sensors of all kinds, multi-sensors fused together to give a holistic picture of a larger volume of airspace, and surface-to-air systems and aerial systems to defend us from all kinds of weapons, which includes ballistic missiles at the higher end to the lowest end, which is the drones. So that is what we need to work on. That should be our key priorities, and which I think the nation is well aware of today.
In fact, the Prime Minister talked of the Sudarshan Chakra mission. I guess these elements will actually be an essential part of that larger
Yes.
umbrella as well. Any before we close, any final thoughts you would like to kind of add on that bit, if any?
So people think Sudarshan Chakra, while the name is new, conceptually it is nothing new. It has just been given a name. This is what the Indian Air Force has been working on for the last 2 decades.
Yeah.
Unsung, but facts. Okay, but we kept it quiet because it was a national security matter.
Yes.
So that is how we reached where we reached with our air defense system.
Mhm.
Please understand that peacetime role is with the Air Force. Should anything happen immediately, the first responder is Air Force.
Yeah.
Army fits in only during operations. Because Army in peacetime doesn't put on their radars and fit into their system. They do it only in operations. So, but factoring the Army into our war fighting is a very critical aspect. So now the challenge which we are faced with today is you have to have a holistic air defense system which takes care not only in war but also in peacetime. So responsibilities will increase here. Integration of Army and Air Force is very important, and they form a very necessary part. But they will all form a part of this larger construct of what we call, which I was saying, that extended integrated air defense system. You can give all kinds of names, but the fact of it means is that a huge volume of sensor shooters connected together for the future. And that is what I think is Sudarshan Chakra is all about.
Thank you, sir. That was really, really enlightening and insightful. And we are almost 50 minutes now, so we'll wind up the session here. Thank you everyone for joining us. That's all for today. And on that note, we'll be back in 2 weeks for another episode of Interpreting India. To be sure and you don't miss, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or any other podcast that you look up to. And to learn more about our research and our team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media, all platforms, X, Facebook, Instagram. Thank you for a patient listening and hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much.